Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Ville Chillin' Podcast. I just wanted to jump on here before the episode starts to say that this one is a lot different than things we normally talk about. We normally talk about festivals and art and parks. This one talks about some much more important social issues. So, with that being said, it's not necessarily for all ages, so please keep that in mind as you're listening. However, the subject being talked about and the guest that we have is very, very important. Our friend Donna is doing amazing work through the Commonwealth, the city, and across the nation. And Ashes to Flame, it's a hard read, as I've said in the episode, but it is so important to things that we need to make sure we change as a country, as a culture, as a Commonwealth, and everything in between. So please, if you haven't read it, make sure to pick up a copy of Ashes to Flame. And again, keep in mind this episode isn't necessarily the best for all ages. With that, I hope you find the discussion interesting. I hope you find it enlightening, informative, and everything in between. And we'll get right into it.
They're off in the Kentucky Derby.
Interest of the greater good for me to smoke a joint and calm down.
He'll fall an eight to prove that I'm great. And if he keeps talking jive, I'm going to cut it to 5.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Ville Chillin' Podcast. Today, we are talking to my friend Donna. We've known each other, I don't even know how long now, probably 8 or 10 years at this point. And I've always really admired your work, as you know, after I heard about it, especially after I had Annabelle. And so it's really awesome to be able to bring you on. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be able to be on your show.
So to start off, full disclosure, I took something from your Facebook page because I think it was perfect. You know, when you, in the bio, you have mother, author, speaker, advocate, or mother, writer, speaker, advocate, and then author of Ashes to Flame. I think it's really important, or I think it's a cue in my mind that you put mother first. Yeah. I think that's really cool. So, I mean, you definitely have your hands full. You do a lot. I know it's what, college season now for Willow, isn't it? So, a lot going on. And so, for anybody who doesn't know, Ashes to Flame is about transforming trauma into purpose. It's a pretty powerful story, a hard read in a lot of ways, but a necessary read to make sure that change can even occur. There has to be a catalyst before there's change, right? So to really start out with that title, Transforming Trauma into Purpose, how would you define trauma for the general population?
That's a really great question, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a long answer, so just bear with me on that. So trauma is essentially the way that our bodies and minds respond to something harmful happening to us. And I think a lot of folks are familiar with the term PTSD, also known as post-traumatic stress disorder. But what a lot of people are not familiar with is something called complex PTSD. And that is a diagnosis that has been more recently uncovered and put out. The difference between them is that PTSD can occur when one or maybe even a few traumatic experiences happen to an individual over a certain amount of time, whereas complex PTSD refers to the chronic abuse that occurs. So when you have somebody that's in childhood that is repeatedly experiencing abuse, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, abandonment, there are so many different things that creates this chronic environment where this child could just never take a deep breath and feel safe. That can lead to complex PTSD. And there's a bunch of intersectionality and comorbidities between complex PTSD symptoms and other personality disorders. So again, it's a very long way of saying that trauma itself is our body and mind's response to a situation, but it doesn't live at the timing of the situation necessarily. our bodies integrate it into our DNA, into our muscle memory, and we take that forth into our day-to-day lives.
Gotcha. Yeah, that definitely a much broader answer. When you look it up, like from a dictionary, it's just a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. But I think the more important definition is exactly what you just explained, which is how that correlates over long periods of time. Because I mean, there's obviously like the medical definition of trauma, like a bruise is technically trauma. But when you start talking about the mental factor of it, the psychological factor of it, it definitely has a much more, I don't even know how to say it, like robust meaning, I guess.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say it absolutely has a robust meaning. And what's interesting is that the trauma that happens within our brains when we have experienced those prolonged abusive situations ends up rewiring the way that we think about things. Or if our abuse starts happening early on in life, it creates this facade of our perception in relation to the world. So I may be in a situation, having grown up with my parents being both very abusive in their own ways, my view of the world is going to be that in which no one is trustworthy. And that in which when I go outside of my home, and even sometimes within my home, in previous situations, I could not relax. I had to always be on guard, right? I always had to have this edge and be looking around for all the harm that could come my way. And when you do that, you're creating this narrative around the safety of your environment, even if you have escaped the abusive environment years later, 20, 30, 40 years later, you're sitting in a situation that's completely different. But because you have this wiring that has happened in your brain, you are keeping this narrative that you're not safe. And that's the thing about complex PTSD is that what happens to bring those narratives back can often just be emotional triggers. And that can be somebody using a, stern tone of voice, right? Somebody like, probably over a year ago, my husband and I were at the grocery store and we went to get like a little piece of cheesecake out of the refrigerated aisle or what have you. And, I perceived in the second, because I think we both went to reach for it, and I perceived his tone was harsh and just immediately felt frozen, and he wasn't even upset. But it's just the perception that I had because it took me back to a time when I was a kid and when, doing something that was perceived as out of line by my mother would have been a very dangerous position for me to be in. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about those emotional flashbacks where we're brought back to those spaces.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not going to go too deep into the books. I definitely want people to read it and read the story for themselves, but it even just the start, like the very first paragraph, I think really outlines how early it can start. And then, I mean, I think you said it, you were still crawling, or you were like 1 or 2, I think, when you first start the book, and had experiences like with your mom, just, a harsh response, an unnecessary response when you should understand you're dealing with a child who things are going to happen. And to deal with that day to day, I guess it kind of just normalizes it. And you don't really know, as a kid especially, you don't know that's just normal. That's just how the world is. And I could see how that has lasting impact. And it's crazy. And
it is. And I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you. Go ahead, though.
No, I was just going to say it's awesome that people are starting to speak out about it more. It seems like over the last few years, it started to become more normal to actually speak out about it and be able to experiences, even though I know it's got to be tough. I can't imagine how hard it was to be able to lay all that out there. So, kudos to you again. But I'm glad that it's finally kind of being more accepted to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up 2 things that I'd really like to touch on as well. One of the things that you said that I think is so important to unpack is where you talk about the way that those chaotic and abusive situations become normalized in children, right? And so, again, that narrative that starts getting created in your brain is that this is what you can expect from life. This is what you can expect from relationships, from people in general. And so, what does that do ultimately? It puts us in this position where if we don't disrupt that cycle and seek true, authentic healing for ourselves, we carry forward that generational trauma to our children. And, a big part of the reason that my mother was so abusive, and trust me, this is not making excuses for her in any way, shape, or form. But, as I talk about in the book as well, my mother grew up in an extremely abusive environment, and she experienced all forms of abuse herself and neglect. They lived in poverty. Her dad died when she was 11. She didn't have a chance either. And so by the time she had me, her brain was already in this state with its own narrative. She had her own responses to the world, her own perceptions of the world, and that was cast onto me. And, for me to go on and become a mother, just as you said, that is very intentionally the first word in my bio. And the reason for that is honestly becoming a mother initially when I was 18 years old. And then again, when I had Willow, when I was 23, those are the things that ultimately started to set me free and started to put me on a path of realizing that if I didn't start becoming okay with myself, and more than just a surface level, but like truly deeply internally, then I was going to end up carrying this forward to them. And I certainly was not a perfect mother. I certainly had things that I had to work through and that I had to catch myself and say, oh no, I'm not going down this path. I'm not going to be who my mother was. But that is how those cycles start to break, is when you're willing to acknowledge that something is not working and something is causing harm. And when you're willing to face that, and when you're willing to say, I'm willing to do the work on myself to make this stop, that is where you start to break those cycles.
Yeah, and that was going to be one of my questions too. Is, how did you go about making those changes? Obviously had to make within yourself to make sure you didn't put that view of the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's that changing ourselves is never easy, especially with things that.
Mm-hmm.
And but seeing, knowing that having children was kind of the catalyst to say, I'm not going to give them the same outlook that was forced on me. That's definitely a start. And it's hard for people to recognize they have to do that. But
right.
I mean, having known you for how long I have, and I've met Willow several times, she's awesome kid. You've done an amazing job.
Thank you.
Going places.
She is, for sure. And I think honestly, it was a matter of starting to see, especially with Willow, and, I go into detail in the book about the experience with my oldest daughter, who I'd very limited custody of when she became older. I go into all the details of what contributed to all that and everything in the book. But I did end up getting, 3 years in as she was a bit older with my oldest daughter. And we do have a relationship now where, we do talk on occasion. On occasion, we'll meet for dinner and such. And so there's definitely efforts to repair the years that we did not get together. But for Willow and, being in a position with her where I was able to be there from the very beginning. And I was the consistent, safe adult that was in her life from the very beginning. Seeing the way that her own inner child would emerge as she's at these incredibly tender ages started touching my own inner child, And so I started recognizing her innocence, that I also had innocence. And when she would we would walk through the park and, be in this world of play where we're recognizing all the colors on the trees and, how the earth feels beneath our feet and all of that. It was just like I was rediscovering the world in a way through her eyes, because I didn't have the chance as a child at her ages to experience the wonder of the world in those safe, joyful ways. And so my inner child started becoming seen as I was witnessing her developing her own. And being able to lean into that tenderness meant that I got to start being more tender with myself. And so over the years, during my 20s, especially once I escaped, a very abusive situation with my perpetrator, my 20s very much became focused on stabilizing financially and making sure that I got an education so that I could build my career and, all these things. But it was also about encountering those childlike moments where I could honor my inner child while I was raising Willow. And then as I started getting into my late 20s and, my early 30s, when I began the advocacy work, I started at that point realizing that, all these little things that were coming up for me, like the fact that I also very much enjoyed My Little Pony, right? When Willow was watching that too.
Annabelle
These
loves
were
that
things
right
that were
now.
to be celebrated because it was me saying that young part of me that never got attention and that never got acceptance, I could give that to her while I was giving it to my baby girl as well.
That's so. I mean, that's an awesome way to be able to experience that, and it. At least you got to feel that way. Re-experience childhood almost in a way. While that's really powerful, I think, and it says a lot about the path of healing that comes along with trying to beat the. I guess you can never beat trauma, but you can at least not let it rule your life. And that's such a way to look at it.
Absolutely. And I think that's very powerful what you just said, right? I mean, it's not a matter of beating trauma, and it's not a matter of trying to eradicate our past, because we can't do either. But what we can do is step into our higher selves and our more sovereign selves and recognize that as these adults that we have become, and as we lean into those parts of us that deserve healing and that we, pour into that healing, that we're able to gather up our inner children, so to speak, right? And bring them with us on this journey. So if that's a matter of me, sitting with that little 5-year-old girl that I was when, I confided something in my mother only to be extremely dismissed and abused even at that moment, I can sit with her when her fear starts to arise, and I can recognize it and I can witness it, and I can pour in love and patience and kindness to it. Same with my adolescent. My adolescent is a pissed off 14-year-old girl, let me tell you. And when she starts, getting where, everything just feels like it's overwhelming and it's caving in, and I just want to go and play baseball, I can take myself, or, fortunately now my husband and I can go to the batting cages and let that energy out, right? But it is about recognizing we're not bad, and our emotional responses to things that are crappy things that have happened, they're not bad. We are worth loving, we're worth celebrating, and we are worth honoring exactly where we are.
Absolutely. I don't think there's really a way to approach it, really. So moving on a little bit, for anybody who doesn't know, hasn't read the book, I mean, but you've spoke about it multiple times. You ended up getting married at a very young age, right? It's 16?
Yeah.
16?
Mm-hmm.
And someone much older than that.
Right.
And that's the advocacy work that you've done there, I think, is really powerful. And I know you worked with Andy Bashir, right, to help change the laws, the child marriage laws in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. What are some of the stats? I know they're in the book. They're in the epilogue, I think, of the book, and you've shared it in numerous places. But what are some of the stats that go along with child marriage that you would share?
Mm-hmm. So yes, in the state of Kentucky, prior to Senate Bill 48 taking place, which took away the ability of children to be married with parental consent, prior to that taking effect, between the years 2000 and 2015, there were almost 11,000 children that were married in the state of Kentucky alone. When we look at this on a national scale, most recent statistics have shown that even with some states having passed child marriage legislation that would prohibit children from being married through parental consent, we still have had nearly 300,000 cases of child marriage occur since the year 2000. And what's incredibly important to note about this is that a lot of people think, well, if kids are getting married, it's this Romeo and Juliet situation where it's two 16-year-olds or two 17-year-olds and, maybe they're pregnant, or what have you, right? But they very much see it as two teenagers in love. When you look at the statistics, the overwhelming majority of cases of underage marriage involve a girl that is young enough, with the age disparity of the person that she's being married off to being so great that if it hadn't been for the marriage license, it could have been prosecuted as a statutory rape case. And that is one of the things that we found in the state of Kentucky. Prior to us changing the law, girls under the age of 16 could marry. There was no minimum floor. There just had to be a pregnancy involved. And then a judge had to sign off on that. And I know you hear that and you think, well, there's not a judge in their right mind that would sign a kid off to be in a predatory situation. But unfortunately, when we analyzed the statistics, there was a 13-year-old girl, again, pregnant, married off to a 33-year-old man, and a 15-year-old girl, again, pregnant, married off to a 52-year-old man. And then when we start looking at the 16 and 17-year-old population, again, that age disparity was so significant, it could have been prosecuted as statutory rape. And that's in Kentucky. Yes, that's in also multiple states. There are only, I believe at this point, 11 states altogether that completely ban child marriage, meaning the age of 18 is the minimum. We continue to work on legislation. I will say that one of the things that was so empowering about having that legislation passed in 2018 was the fact that when Andy Beshear was our Attorney General, he formed what he called a Survivors Council. And that Survivors Council was comprised of many survivors across the state of Kentucky who had gone through horrendous crimes. And because they had been through those horrendous crimes, they knew the failing of the community, they knew the failing of the system, and they had the voice to be able to speak up about it. And that is how I got involved initially in changing the laws in Kentucky and then beyond, was because I was given a platform by our Attorney General at that time, Andy Beshear, to be able to say, this was my experience. This is how the system failed me repeatedly. And this is what we need to do to make sure this never happens to another child.
And just to expand on some of the statistics, I have your book right here. Child brides have a 23% greater risk of developing serious health conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, or stroke. 130% more likely to become pregnant than unmarried teens, and more than 3 times likely to have at least 5 children. And this economy can barely afford one, so I can't even imagine. And that's going to be at a young age, obviously. If they're a teenager with their first kid, then they're going to have all those kids well before they can even establish a career. Mm-hmm. 31% more likely to live in poverty, 50% more likely to drop out of high school, and 4 times less likely to graduate college. And I think those are some very powerful statistics to share too, because it's all happening before, like I said, before you're even able to establish yourself in your own life. You're expected to take care of other lives, and there's not a lot of options. Being a parent is not easy, and it shouldn't be something that should be forced upon somebody at such a young age. And even if it's not necessarily forced, that's because of those situations of child marriage, I guess. It normalized it, going back to that word. It made it okay. And those statistics, you can't really beat stats. You know me, I'm a data guy, so I have to present that data because it speaks for itself, or you would think it does.
Absolutely does. Yeah.
So some other states, were you involved in changing the laws in like Indiana and Tennessee as well?
Yes.
I don't think I even knew that until I read the book, and that's really powerful in and of itself, not just here in Kentucky, but multiple states. I think the outcome for the Kentucky bill, I don't think it's exactly what you wanted, right? It wasn't an outright ban. You have to be 18. But I think when I read the bill, the stipulations are so strict that you almost pretty much have to be 18.
Mm-hmm.
And that's that. What are those stipulations?
Mm-hmm. So it no longer is allowable that parental consent is the only deciding factor. It increases the age for marriage to 17, regardless of if there's a pregnancy involved. The 17-year-old would have to evidence that they have lived independently for the past 90 days. They would have had to have already obtained their GED or their high school diploma. They have to be able to evidence some form of self-sufficiency as far as income goes as well. And the age disparity between the 17-year-old and the person that they are marrying cannot be greater than 4 years. So there are definitely protective parameters in place. The other thing that makes the legislation different is that the 17-year-olds, upon the judge authorizing the fact that, they will proceed forth with issuing a marriage license for the 17-year-old, that 17-year-old then becomes emancipated. Emancipation is simultaneously granted with issuing of the marriage license, which is different than the marriage actually happening. So let's say we have all these safety perimeters in place and this minor's in this coercive relationship, and that's not picked up on by our officials. But then this minor is in the situation where the marriage license has been granted. That means that they, now that they are emancipated, have the legal authority as an adult to say, no, I'm not going through with this. We have empowered them with enumerated rights as an emancipated minor. I want to go back to something that you said a second ago as well, where you were talking about, being a mother at such a young age. The statistics that you brought up, of course, are extremely important and compelling. And you were talking about having multiple kids early on as well. Statistically, girls who marry under the age of 18 will have 5 children by the time that they're 25 years old. And let's also talk about the fact that without those legal rights as an adult, you don't even have consent to your own health care. So let's say you get pregnant and you miscarry. Well, unless your, adult person that you married is willing to take you to the hospital, then you can't even consent to treatment for that or any other ailment that you may end up having. Same with treatment for your kids. How are you going to take your kid to the pediatrician if you can't consent to their healthcare because you are a 15-year-old girl, right? So there's so many different problems centered around the power imbalance between kids that are married and these adults that they're being married off to.
Well, and to add to that, I think I also learned in your book that even if you decide you want to escape that situation, most women's shelters won't even take you in if you're not 18.
Yes. And I will say that from what I've heard from working with the Kentucky Center Against Domestic Violence and the Kentucky Sexual Assault programs, present day, they would not be as strict as they were back in the year 2000, 2001, when I was experiencing this. But yes, at that time, you couldn't even go to a domestic violence shelter. And I will tell you that in the state of Kentucky, I think we've gotten better about that. That's not the case. I've talked to survivors from across all over the U.S. who have said that even present day, they have restricted access to protective factors. The other thing about that is that when you are a married minor, you no longer have access to child protective services. So you're in this legal gray area because you're not an adult, and you can't make adult decisions, and you can't enter a contract on your own, but you also do not have access to be protected by CPS because you're not considered a kid anymore. So it just places these child brides, including myself when I was 16 years old, in these horrible situations where you're just trapped until, you can find it within yourself to get out. And even, during those years, the brainwashing by predators is very real. And it does continue that narrative that you hold within about how limited you are, how limited your options are. One of the things you said too, Aaron, that I want to touch on really quickly as you were going through the stats as far as, the health issues, the poverty, all of those things. We can not talk about, as a society, as a country, we place so much emphasis on eradicating poverty and on eradicating lack of education opportunities and on doing away with addiction, right? Ensuring that, programs are operating efficiently to address addiction, alcoholism, and all of that. All of these are symptoms of generational trauma. I mean, think about it. If you are in a situation where, your parents were extremely abusive, maybe they used alcohol as a form to cope or what have you, and you bore witness to that and you carry that on into your life. And so you're not able to really cope. And when you're not able to really cope, you can't really hold down a job. And when you can't hold down a job, you don't have access to health insurance, especially with the way that Medicaid and Medicare is going right now. And so where does that take you? That puts you in a situation where you're sick all the time. And when you're sick all the time, you're in this cycle where you cannot work. And then that passes along to your children. And your children are in a situation where they can absorb the information they're learning at school. And so the cycle just repeats. We have to begin realizing that in order to stop the bleeding of these situations, we have to pass common sense legislation that would end child marriage, that would lessen the restrictions of the statute of limitations, especially around reporting sex crimes, and that we are redefining what statutory rape is as well. Those key things, passing legislation immediately that would stop that bleeding, would allow our families to be able to start the authentic recovery process. And therefore, 25, 30, 35 years from now, hopefully we would not be having these same conversations at the level that we are right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. And I mean, I do think strides have been made probably since the year 2000, since people have been not since 2000, but in the last 5-10 years at least, change is happening, right. But it's a process. And that's all of the change that has happened is thanks to people like you and other survivors, other people out against it. People like Andy Beshear as Attorney General forming councils like he did. And in a large way, it's up to the politicians too, because when it came to Senate Bill 48, wasn't it? It wasn't just a blanket approval. Right. There were still people who were against it. And that, for me, it blows my mind that people could be like, oh, no, it's not that big of a deal, essentially, is what they're saying.
Absolutely. Well, and what's interesting is that we weren't even going to get a hearing in the Judiciary Committee. So when legislation initially gets filed, it is placed in a committee that is representative of the type of legislation that it is, right? And since this is legislation that could impact the way that judges make decisions and the type of cases that come before judges, it was referred to the Judiciary Committee. And they had the bill. They were not going to give us a hearing. And had it not been for consistent lobbying, I mean, I was literally showing up in Frankfurt at least twice a week for probably about 3 months to talk with people I had never met before. And, Aaron, you know very well what an introvert I am. So, for me to be showing up, total imposter syndrome, going through the halls of Frankfurt, trying to shake hands and introduce myself and talk about this legislative initiative that was so important. It was very overwhelming, but it was also very worth it. And, fortunately, we did have some politicians that did very much believe in the effort as well. Senator Julie Rocky Adams, who is still in the state Senate, she actually sponsored the bill and did a great job, pushing against the lack of engagement from some of the other folks. I will say that when we eventually did get that Judiciary Committee hearing, I did have a lot of resistance come up. But I was also able to address that because one of the most outspoken people against the idea of changing the child marriage age is also a very conservative Republican that places a lot of emphasis on family values. And when he spoke out against what I was trying to accomplish for the children of our Commonwealth, I told him that when you look at the statistics, 83% of underage marriages result in divorce. So if we are talking about preserving the family unit, we need to stop putting children in positions that they're just not ready for.
Absolutely. It blows my mind again that it wasn't just blanket support, but then again, like you said earlier when we were talking about the child marriage before the bill, most people would see that and think, well, no judge is going to approve that anyways. And overwhelmingly they did. Because at the end of the day, the judge is there to interpret the law and make a ruling based on the law.
Right.
There's exceptions to where they can say no, but their job isn't to let feelings get involved. Their job is to interpret the law and essentially execute the law, or, make sure that it's just it's being done legally. And so it requires getting in front of the politicians and everything. And I'm so glad that it is continuing to spread out, I haven't looked into what changes were made in like Indiana and Tennessee. Were those like blanket bans, you have to be 18, or were they kind of similar to what happened here in Kentucky? Those stipulations.
Very similar to what happened here in Kentucky. Actually, the state of Tennessee, which is where my marriage at 16 took place, they actually took the bill language that I had worked on with folks at the Tahoe Justice Center and, of course, with Julie Rocky Adams as well. They took that bill language, and that is what they used for their state. The senators from there were in contact with our senators here. So that very much felt like things coming, full circle and advancing it forward. Now, unfortunately, there have also been some politicians that in more recent years have looked to undo that. And as far as I know, as of yet, they have not been successful in that. But that's something we have to keep an eye on. Once protections are achieved for kids, we can't roll that back. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. For the state of Indiana, it was very similar as well. I believe that at the time, and I think it was 2019 when they passed their legislation, it was, I believe they settled at the age of 15, which again is egregiously low to me. But one of the things that somebody told me when I was lobbying for Senate Bill 48 was don't let good be the enemy of perfect. And, whereas it's not exactly good, it is progress. And when you're talking about states that have zero protections for kids in this regard, to be able to achieve something is a reason to be hopeful of what can come in the future.
Yep, absolutely. It can always be improved upon, and it's easier to improve upon it than have to get it going in the first place, or God forbid it gets repealed or whatever, than having to do all that work all over again. Better. So moving past that a little bit, you were actually part of a documentary on child marriage, right? And that was a national documentary. You talked about being an introvert. For one, did that happen before or after some of the changes that were made here in Kentucky? And then what was that whole experience like?
Yeah, so that actually happened simultaneously with the changes happening in Kentucky. I was approached just by someone finding my website and, having seen other interviews and such that I had done. And they said A&E was going to be putting together this documentary on people that had been married underage, and they wanted to highlight the problematic nature of that and talk about the advocacy to change laws. And so, I did a video interview with them, and they said, "This is great, you're in." And the next thing you know, I have producers flying in here from, New York, California, all of that, with film crew to follow me around and the advocacy efforts, as well as, do some one-on-one interviews about my history. It was extremely daunting, to be honest. It was extremely exhausting. I think what is unseen about that time in my life is that not only was I doing this advocacy work, I had a film crew following me around. I was giving at least 2 interviews to national media per week virtually, whether it was over the phone, whether it was in front of a camera, whether it was people coming here. I was having reporters fly in from England. We had Finland correspondents coming here, and it was just crazy the way that it blew up. So, I'm in the middle of doing this healing work and using my healing work in this advocacy movement. I'm still working full time. I was still working for the employer where, you and I met previously. So I was still doing that. And I was launching a nonprofit. And I was still taking care of, my then 9, 10, 11-year-old daughter, right? Willow was much younger. So all that to say, I was burning the candle at both ends and ended up crashing after doing that for like 4 years consistently. It was a big lesson learned for me about the importance of self-care, and an even bigger lesson in realizing that in advocacy, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? And so getting really clear about attainable goals and the time frame that you are going to put forth energy to attain those, that is something that very much started to open my eyes of how I was living my life, even through that process of advocacy, in survival mode, where everything has to happen right now. And everything has to be done perfectly. And I have to be the best that I can be in every situation. And everyone has to see me as so strong. Being able to come back from that and realize, ooh, that entire time frame was symptomatic of me having complex PTSD. That in and of itself was freeing.
Yeah, you were still very much in your own healing process. I'm sure that's still a day-to-day anyways. And so taking on so much, like you said, it's symptomatic of just got to do it. We got to do it all now while the opportunity's there, while it's being presented. But yeah, I can't imagine. I know you were very busy when we were working together and stuff. And I don't think I really understood quite how busy. I think some of this happened before we really actually started working on the same team.
Mm-hmm.
But then you continued to do more after that as well. Like it was Zonta International, right? When you went to Finland.
Right.
That had to be a pretty big honor to be able to go speak at a conference of that size, and then just getting to experience Finland had to be amazing too. What was that like? And how many people were in attendance at that? It had to be a lot based on what I saw on the video.
Yeah, it was. I'm not entirely sure. I think the theater held up to 700 people, I believe, if I recall correctly. But there were several people in attendance. I was really surprised, to be honest, that I received that invitation. Like I said, I did not anticipate, when I first started advocacy, I was very focused on the state of Kentucky because it's my home state. It's where my mother was born. It's where I was born. It's where my grandmother was born. So it was the place that was most important to me to focus on changing the laws. And all of a sudden, it just took on this international, presence and push. When I was invited to Finland to speak, it was an incredible honor. And it made me feel this sense of deep validation. because, throughout my life, and a big part of this, of course, is the trauma that I suffered early on. And then a big part of it also is the fact that, as a result of my marriage at the age of 16, I had to drop out of 10th grade. So I didn't even complete the 10th grade. And it's so isolating socially to have to say that. It makes people look at you differently if they don't know you going in, to speaking with you initially. So to have that type of invitation made me feel as though I did not have to be defined by the things that happened early on. And there were people in this world that were going to recognize that, and they were going to take me seriously. And that really gave me a big momentum, or a big push into my momentum, I should say, for continuing the advocacy work. Finland is a really cool country for so many reasons. In part, the architecture is just absolutely breathtakingly beautiful. I think I shared with you and some other folks photos of like the cobblestone streets and stuff, and just the way that, their buildings are landscaped, and it's just absolutely breathtaking. But the other really cool thing, and more importantly, about Finland is that they focus so much on quality of life. Folks typically work 32 hours is full time there. They do have free access to healthcare. It works. It works very well for them. It's considered one of the safest places on earth, one of the happiest places on earth. In fact, their neighbor Denmark is consistently voted the happiest place on earth. And again, it's because they do focus on quality of life, and they don't allow things that are going to perpetuate harms to people, such as child marriage. That's something that no longer happens in Finland either. So to be able to go there and be in that environment really gave me hope that we would be able to make those changes here.
That's awesome. I remember, I think when you got the invitation and we talked about it, you could just see the sheer excitement mixed with fear, mixed with a little bit of relief from that validation you spoke on. And it was pretty awesome. Again, I'm glad that for whatever reason, life decided to let us connect and then continue to talk and able to talk about this. So powerful. And for anyone who doesn't know, what is Zonta International? How would you describe that organization?
Zonta International is a professional women's organization that has chapters across the world that focus on doing things to empower women and girls. I love their mission so much. I actually just rejoined the Louisville chapter recently. So
Awesome.
I will be participating directly here in Kentucky. And I hope to be able to sit on one of the international caucuses one day as well. But they do things for women, like ensure that women in other countries have access to clean birth, like they provide materials and things like that. They provide, food or, like undergarments or whatever is needed by women that may not have accessibility to those things. So it's a mission that's near and dear to my heart because these women have had success in their life. I'm sure they've also seen adversity as well, but they turn around and give the things that they have learned along the way, and also tangible items that are needs to people that are in need of that. And, that's the type of servant leadership, I think, that is so transformative, and very much am thrilled that I get to align myself with them again.
Yeah, that's so cool. I remember reading a little bit about them back when you spoke in Finland. And I, again, having Annabelle and everything has really changed. I mean, I've always grown up around women, girls. I have 4 sisters, of course, my mom, Annabelle, but after having Annabelle, it really, the importance of needing to make some of these changes really shone through in my mind, and needing to support that type of stuff. So continuing the theme of giving speeches and stuff, did you speak in front of Congress recently as well for the National Congress, I guess?
I did record a video to submit to Congress.
Okay.
Funny story about that. It was actually happening simultaneously with my husband and I doing Willow's college tour in the Northeast. So I was not able to break away and go to DC because we had already committed to that, and that was kind of a big deal. So I did submit a video that was sent to Congress, and that was in support of the legislation that was filed in the United States Senate back in August. And I believe that bill number is S4990. It was sponsored by Senator Dick Durbin, and it would call to end child marriage in the United States and study the problem to be able to have those statistics to evidence the fact that it needs to happen. And the name of the bill itself is called the Child Marriage Prevention Act. I do continue to submit. In fact, I'm going to be submitting video testimony in the state of Washington very soon as well, because they have legislation that's going through. So we're continuing to work state by state while there has not yet been action that's happened with the federal pending legislation.
It's cool that it's at least being looked at, though. Again, not perfect, but it's progress that it's even being mentioned, that it's being talked about at such a crazy level, or a high level. This might be a little bit of a loaded question because it's Derby weekend, but there have been reports and things about trafficking and stuff at Derby time. Mm-hmm. Are there any statistics to actually show that have been, that have been made public? Because it really shot for something that's supposed to be such an important event for Kentucky's history, Louisville. It can cast such a dark shadow on what should be a shining, prideful moment for Kentuckians.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up too. So I think there's a couple of things to consider when talking about human trafficking. For one thing, specifically around Derby, I'm a little disconnected from the current statistics on, what people see as far as that goes. But I do know from, how I've been plugged into this in historical years that they can see when sporting events happen in big cities, how there will be a spike in human trafficking cases, and then it goes back to a lull, but then you see a spike in another town, so if you've got ball games or traveling from one big city to the other, the Derby event, of course, that just happened yesterday, actually. That you would see those spikes happen. But the other part of that is that the majority of human trafficking cases, just as the majority of childhood sexual abuse cases, go unreported. And a big part of that is because of the stigma and shame that is associated with having survived that. The other part of human trafficking that's so important to keep in mind too is that, yes, whereas these big sporting events like Derby or what have you may generate higher numbers of trafficking because that's where the big parties are happening and such, that doesn't take away from the prevalence day to day of trafficking survivors. And the other thing is that, the society and the media tends to portray trafficking situations where, this creepy white van pulls up and someone hops out and they kidnap someone, right? That is how it's portrayed. That is a very small percentage of what actually happens in trafficking cases. In an overwhelming amount of trafficking cases, well into the 90%, it is between a person and someone they know. And often it is family. Just as in my case, and again, I won't go into the details of this, but, early on, being trafficked out by the person that I was supposed to be married to, who, of course, I later realized was a predator. But it's really important, I think, to have that in mind, because when we're looking at folks that are vulnerable to being trafficked, you can't just look at, kids playing outside on their bikes during a nice summer day, because yes, you want to make sure that you're protecting them and keeping an eye on them, but also, who's watching your kids, right? What's the coach like that's, teaching your kids how to play soccer or what have you? People that are in position of authorities have really large amounts of access to be able to groom children. And that is really the majority of cases when children do end up being trafficked out.
Something you said just a minute ago um, you everything first started when you first married, you didn't realize you're in an abusive relationship. What are some things that people can look for, like within themselves or even people around them, to make them kind of question like the situation they're in, or like a friend is in, or something like that? Like, how did you come to that realization? Like, this is really not normal, and this.
That's a really great question. So quite honestly, I don't think that I started realizing that things were off with the predator until the situation that I described in my book about when his biological mother came over to the apartment when I was spending spring break with him, and some really shady stuff went down that day. And, again, I go into the details of that situation in the book. I won't waste time talking about them on here, but what I realize is that looking back, there, of course, were 14-year-old girl. You don't necessarily know to pick up on them. Um, when somebody is alienating you, for example, like he would talk very badly about my mom, which of course very much reinforced my teenage mentality about my mother. And my mother was not a very nice person. She had abused me in several ways and had allowed me to be abused. But he very much would talk horribly about her and about how he needed to get me away from her and, all these things. Same with my sister. My sister and I were not close at that time, but he would make fun of her. He would make fun of her husband, find ways to dehumanize them. He would call her names that, again, very much dehumanizing, and to try to isolate me. And then he would say things, he would, cross lines and have me do things that I wasn't comfortable with. And he knew that. I'm sure he could tell that even if I didn't vocalize it. But after it happened, he would say things like, "Oh, I just feel so close to you now," and all these things that made me feel like that's what I had to do to be able to really have his acceptance. And there are, numerous other things that I talk about as far as how he groomed me and, the writing of love letters and, all of these things. I think one of the biggest red flags that I wish I had vocalized more when I was a kid is the fact that I wasn't supposed to share his age with anyone, right? He was 29 and I was 14. And it was a big deal that we keep that secret because the way that he said it, nobody would understand because I was the exception. I was so mature for my age and, nobody would understand how, I was so grown up and I wasn't really a 14-year-old, not really mentally. And so, none of that mattered. But all of that grooming, all of that manipulative talk went into, me feeling like, well, he knows best. And I felt the need to protect him, just like I felt the need to protect, my father and the things that he had done, and my mother from some of the things that she had done. And, really coming to terms with that and shrugging off the shame that I internalized in that as well, because a part of me carried this belief for years that I had caused my own abuse because of the fact that I, in other people's words, put myself in that situation. I really had to work hard to shake off the shame from that and realize that no, the person that was responsible for abusing me was the person that abused me and the people that abused me, not me for being in a situation that I was vulnerable to.
Well, and as a kid too,
Mm-hmm.
difference between making certain decisions when you're 20, 30 and making 14, 16, major difference there. Just in understanding the words and being able to pick up on red flags, to say like this isn't right.
Exactly. And, to that point, like Willow is 17, she'll be 18 in June, right? And she's going to an amazing college because she worked her butt off. And as you said earlier, she is an amazing kid. I will totally humble brag about that because she is. But my gosh, I look at her as an extremely mature 17-year-old that works 2 jobs and has a 4.3 something GPA that she's about to graduate with. I still look at her and I'm like, she's a kid. She is 17. And this in no way takes away from, her intelligence or ability, but her emotional maturity is not that of an adult. She is working on that. That's not a knock on her, but she is developing. She is encountering numerous learning opportunities to be able to get there, right? I don't understand how we can live in a society that looks at teenage girls because they have physically developed and try to label them as adults or sexualize them in any way. I mean, it is incredibly dehumanizing and objectifying. These are still kids. They're still learning and growing and are not ready to be in a situation or a relationship with an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure, you've had Willow with you through this whole journey.
Yeah.
When did you decide to start exposing her to and making importance of that so she could make more informed decisions at her age, especially now with her going off to college?
Yeah. So I think she was 9 years old the first time that I took her to a United Nations meeting with me. I was on the board of directors for the United Nations Association starting when she was about 9. And I took her to a meeting where we were going to be screening the movie about Malala. Willow had done her Women's History Month project on Malala. And so she had all this information about her and she was really eager to, be at this meeting. And what was so funny about that was that the president of the UNA at that time, Willow was talking her ear off about all she learned during her project. And she was like, "Oh, do you want to get up and say a few words about her?" And Willow said yes. And I was a little stunned, but, in the spirit of empowering her to feel like she can absolutely own her space, I let her get up and she gave like a 15-minute impromptu speech about Malala and why girls' education is so important to the world. And, it was really, really impactful. Of course, there are certain things that I have shielded her from. It has only been within the last year or so that I've really talked with her about the details of the trafficking and the sexual abuse that I went through. In part. And of course, there's some stuff that I've never told her and that I never will because I don't feel the need to vocalize it to anyone. But I do think that as things are age appropriate to have conversations with kids about, I absolutely think it's imperative to lean into that discomfort and have those conversations. Because I'll tell you, one of the things that has done in my relationship with Willow is that she knows she can come to me with anything, anytime. And we can talk through anything. And if she has a question about anatomy or about healthy relationships versus coercive relationships, we can have that open dialogue in a way where there's no judgment. And that is what I want her to be able to carry forward in her own life and also with her kids. Years down the road when she's ready to have kids, I want them to know that they can also be the authentic versions of themselves and have access to all age-appropriate information.
Absolutely. As Annabelle grows, and I mean, it happens so fast. She's only 6 now, but before I know it, she's going to be 16.
Yeah.
And these are things that have crossed my mind recently. I mean, it starts small, of course. It's like, well, she's still young, but but the more she gets older and, she's going to school and talking about kids having crushes at school, I'm like, you're in kindergarten, kid. Like, let's slow it down a little bit. But even then, it's like it's happening so fast. And in today's world of social media, these topics come up earlier and earlier. And it's hard to navigate as a parent,
Yeah.
But all we can do is just
But,
what we do.
like, even though they're going through these things at, such a young age, like you said, having crushes in kindergarten, right?
Yeah.
It's like, where did that come from? But at the same time, that's how they navigate being in relation to others, right? So they're aware that different relationship dynamics exist in the world, and who do they want to spend time around? Like, what are attractive qualities? And I'm not talking about physically attractive qualities, but
Right.
what are qualities that other people possess that make them want to be around that person? Like, these are all things that just open up these really beautiful opportunities to lean into these conversations with kids and understand better, like, oh, well, if, you have a crush on Jack, what is it about Jack that makes you feel good, right? Like, do you like playing soccer with him or, anything like that? Just really being able to use those as conversation starters with your kids. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, your point, leaning in and having those conversations, be comfortable having tougher conversations later on.
Exactly.
And I think that communication factor, communication's key in any relationship, every relationship. But it's so important when they're young to have open avenues of communication. So do you have advice for anyone who works with kids to be able to recognize signs of trauma, or to at least be able to respond appropriately?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought this conversation up too, because I'll share with you. So Willow works for the YMCA CEP program, which is the Child Enrichment Program. It's a before and after school program. And then, of course, they do summer camp and such as well. It's a great program. I think that, their staff members are pretty well educated on things. But she was sharing with me about how, they had to have a conversation with the kids about sexual abuse. And I think that's great. I think, being able to recognize if a kid starts to become withdrawn, if a kid starts acting out angrily, right? If a kid starts, touching themselves or other kids inappropriately or what have you, these are all signs. And these are conversations that need to be had, of course, with the child and also with the parent. I think one of the most important things to know about that is that you do not want to come across to the child as though they are in trouble. You have got to be able to create a safe space for the child and ask inquisitive questions and not accusatory questions, right? In order to make them feel comfortable speaking with you. The other thing, though, and this is where I think that our communities can do a better job and our programs can do a better job, is what about the parents? Like, how are you going to have a conversation with a parent, right? How are you going to respond if a child discloses abuse to you? Because it's one thing to proactively go into a group of kids and say, we're going to talk about this today. We're going to talk about what safe touch is. We're going to talk about, what to do if somebody puts you in a situation you're uncomfortable with, or, what have you. Those are great conversations to have. But if we're not taking it further and talking about how to effectively respond in those ways that I just listed, then we're doing a disservice to the kid. And we're also doing a disservice to the family, because a lot of times, in the majority of cases, again, when kids are abused, it's someone that they know. And when you are bringing something up to a parent, you have to understand that, for one thing, the parent could be an abuser, or if they're not, then they could be have a very volatile reaction to the idea of something having happened. So you have to be super cautious in having these conversations, again, with inquisitive questions and not from an accusatory standpoint. And then also, how do you help a kid? Let's say a kid is removed and they're put into a foster care situation. A lot of time, there are a lot of great foster families. There are some that are not so great. How do you help a kid navigate being back in a school environment when they're no longer with their parents? And what about when other kids are asking questions about that, right? So again, I definitely think there's a lot of opportunity to have better training on that. And that is one of the things that I'm hopeful to be able to advance forward in my position with the Juvenile Justice Advisory Board. They have done a ton of really great work on this. I think that we do have some opportunities to, really refine some trainings and figure out whose hands they belong in.
That's awesome. If anybody, like you mentioned, like asking the right questions and stuff, are there any resources that people can find, whether online or in a book, or pick up the phone and call and say, hey, how do I approach this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are all kinds of resources out there. There is an organization called Kentucky Youth Advocates. That organization can be Googled. They have a lot of really great trainings that are available. Here in Louisville, there's the Exploited Children's Help Organization, who also provides a lot of really great trainings. I do think that it's also important to recognize survivor-led trainings, and that is something that if anyone's interested in those, I can certainly be a point of assistance for that. And my website is trauma2purpose.com.
Awesome. I think I've pretty much covered everything that I had. Jack, I don't know if you have anything extra.
No, sorry, I've just been listening. You're amazing, Donna. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I want to end it off by just mentioning something that Mariel Hemingway put so eloquently as she does, and that's that the whole Ashes to Flame, transforming trauma into purpose, is more than a memoir. It's definitely a movement. I think all of your actions, from your story, everything before publishing, and everything you continue to and plan to do, it's really testament to that fact. And so I think that's awesome. It's awesome that she took the time to say everything she did anyways. I know that review can be found, I think, on your Facebook, maybe even on your website. But I think that really hit the nail on the head with just that one sentence. So thank you for everything you continue to do. It's making a better world for Annabelle. And I mean, obviously, that's my perspective. That's the most important thing to me at this point. Absolutely. But it is so important on a global scale. So thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for being so transparent. Again, there's a lot more detail in the book, but if anybody hasn't read it, they definitely should. It's a hard read, like I said at the beginning, but I think it's a necessary read for anyone who wants to understand what it's really like for people who experience trauma and then survive the trauma and being able to refine themselves to turn it into purpose, like you said. That, I think we'll end it there, unless you have anything you want to say, anything you want to plug.
No, just a big heartfelt gratitude for your guys' time. I really appreciate these conversations. You know that I can talk for hours about this topic, and really appreciate you all highlighting these important conversations. And thank you for everything that you're doing as a safe dad for your daughter. And I think that it's so important, especially for men, to be able to lean into these uncomfortable conversations, because it makes a world of difference in how your kids grow to trust you.
Yeah, I will add to that just a little bit, that it's always a little, I don't want to say uncomfortable, especially because I've known you for so long, but we're two guys on screen talking about nothing that it doesn't impact us in the same way, in the same mannerism. So we really appreciate people like you who are willing to come on and give us that space to even be able to talk about it and show that there are men out there willing to support, who want to support however we can. Sometimes we just don't know how to, I guess. But no, I appreciate everything you just said too. So I think we'll end it there, and we will see everybody Next one.
They're off in the Kentucky Derby.
Interest of the greater good for me to smoke a joint and calm down.
I am the greatest. He'll fall an 8 to prove that I'm great. And if he keeps talking jive, I'm going to cut it to 5.